So we're going to close out the fifth chapter of Maaser Sheni, and indeed the whole tractate of Maaser Sheni, with a historical update. And it's quite a surprising historical update. Yochanan Kohen Gadol he'evir hodayot ha'maaser. Yochanan, the high priest, stopped the declaration of the Maaser. He stopped people doing this. And he is, by the way, one of the generations of the Hasmoneans. So he must be around 100 years before the Common Era. So he's one of the children of the Hasmoneans who came to power after the war against the Greeks. So this is 100 years before the Common Era. And he stopped people doing it. And there are different explanations as to why. And the Bartanura actually has a history that alludes to Ezra stopping the people giving the Maaser to the Leviim because the Leviim didn't come back from Babylon. So for whatever reason, the practice of giving Maaser is not being completed fully in the time of Yochanan, and he stops it. And he also stops Afu Bitel. He's making various changes. Afu Bitel et ha-Mo'ororim. Who are the Mo'ororim? Well, look at the Tehillah in the next, just below. Ura lama tishan Hashem hakitza altiznach lanetzach. Wake up. Why do you sleep? It's an address to God to wake up. It's one of the Tehillim that the Leviim actually used to sing. So maybe the Leviim didn't come back from Bavel, but hang on, they're certainly singing in the temple. And he doesn't like this Tehillah because it suggests that God is sleeping. So he stopped them singing it. And then he stopped the strikers. The strikers are people who used to, different commentators used to strike animals that were about to be sacrificed. And again, the Bartanura says they used to strike it on its head to make it bleed a little bit so it couldn't see when they would turn it upside down to shechten. Or maybe they used to strike it to stun it. But in the first case, it makes it look like a blemished animal is being offered up on the altar. In the second case, it looks like a stunned animal is being shechted. And he stopped it. And then, Ve'ad yamav haya patish makebi Yerushalayim. And until his time, you could hear the hammer in Jerusalem. And this seems to be during Chol HaMoed. Generally, we don't work in Chol HaMoed, but urgent work was carried out on Chol HaMoed. And he stopped it. He stopped this work because it essentially degraded the essence of the festival to have the sound of hammers banging on copper through the whole of the city. And in his time, people no longer needed to ask about damai. They assumed effectively that anything that they bought from an Amharetz, from someone who wasn't strict about tithing, they assumed that it was doubtfully tithed, and he ordained that they just had to separate the parts. That they just had to separate the Trumat Maaser, which went to the Kohen, the 10th of the 10th, and the Maaser Sheni, which they could eat themselves in Jerusalem. So the financial cost of keeping Truman Maaser was far reduced. And maybe that's the connection with Maaser Sheni, that maybe that's why the tractate finishes on this point, because he waives many of the tithes, but he makes sure that Maaser Sheni is still observed. Maybe that's why the tractate finishes at this point. And for reference, if you want to look at it later, I've actually put the Bartanura's explanation, which is very, very long, just at the end of the source sheet. And I don't want to go into it now because we need to keep moving. But I do want to say the Hadran, because we've gone through Maaser Sheni. Hadran alach masechet Maaser Sheni. We will return to you Maaser Sheni. Ve hadrach halan, and you will return to us. Da'atan alach masechet Maaser Sheni ve'da'tach alan. Our mind is on you, tractate Maaser Sheni, and your mind is on us. La nit nashay minach masechet Maaser Sheni. You will not be forgotten by us, tractate Maaser Sheni, and you will not forget us. Velo tit nashay minan. Lo ba'alma haden, not in this world. Velo ba'alma da'ati, and not in the next world. So we kind of keep our minds on the Masechet of Maaser Sheni, and we think it keeps its mind on us. And we close out the Masechet, and we move on to the Masechet of Hallah. Hallah and Maaser Sheni are they're anyway. We're going to see they're closely connected. We're going to see they're closely connected, but in order to see that, in order to approach the Masechet of Hallah, we need a pasuk, and as ever, we always start the Masechet with a pasuk, and this pasuk actually comes from the Sedra of Shlach, of the spies. Shlach lecha anashim, send spies or send people to spy out the land, and that is a disastrous episode in the life. It's a disastrous episode in the history of the people of Israel. They come to the edge of the land. They're afraid to go into the land. And at the end of that disastrous story, they are given a mitzvah related to going into the land, as if God is saying, look, we know you're not going to go into the land. We promise that your children's generation will go in. And here's a mitzvah that they're going to fulfill when they come into the land. Speak to the people and say, when you enter the land and you eat, when you enter the land which I give you, and you eat of the bread of the land, tarimu truma lashem, you're going to take up some truma. You're going to take up a gift for God. Reshit arisotechem, the first yield of your, it's translated here as baking, but it's dough actually. Reshit arisotechem, the first bit of your dough. Hallah tarimu truma, you shall set aside a loaf as a gift. Ki trumat goran, like the gift from the threshing floor. So in other words, the gift from the dough is like the gift from the threshing floor. Hallah is a kind of maaser, just like truma. It's just like truma and maaser. It's a tax. And then the pasuk goes on, Mereshit arisotechem, from the beginnings of, from the first part of your dough, titanu lashem truma le dorotechem. You shall make a gift to God from the first yield of your baking, le dorotechem, throughout the ages. That's the verse. And there's a dispute brought down in the Mishnah in Eduyot as to how much you have to give. The verse doesn't say you have to, the verse says you have to take some out, but it doesn't say how much you have to take out. And it doesn't say how much dough is subject to the law of Hallah. And the question of how much dough is subject is a dispute in the Mishnah of Eduyot, and Beit Hillel says it's 2 kavs, and Shammai says it's 1 kav. A kav is just about a liter, actually. Maybe it's 1.5 liters. Something like that. And the sages compromise on 1.5 kavs. So that's somewhere about, if a kav is about 1 liter, it's getting on for 2 liters, and it's getting on for 1.5 liters, which is not far off from 1.5 kilos. And which is more or less the measure we use today, actually, about 1.5 kilos of dough, and you have to take hallah. We kind of know that. And the Mishnah is then going to begin so that's a dispute in Eduyot. It's actually not brought in the Masechet, but the Masechet begins by talking about what kinds of grain are subject to Hallah. And we're going to get into the 5 species. There are 5 species which are subject to Hallah. And these are the 5 species that the land of Israel is known for: wheat, barley, spelt, oats, and rye. These are the 5 famous species. And they're subject to Hallah. And dough made from different kinds of grains, if it's all kneaded together, it all adds up to make up the 1.5 kilos. And all kinds of other halachot apply to these grains. So, for example, their new harvest is prohibited prior to Pesach. So it's a pasuk in Emor that all grain, velechem vekali lo tochlu ad haviyachem et omer hatznufa. We bring an omer of new grain the day after Pesach, and the new crop can't be eaten until the omer's been brought. So the new harvest is prohibited prior to Pesach. You can't reap it prior to the Omer being brought. And then the Mishnah concludes, Im hishrishu kodem la Omer, if they took root before the Omer is brought, then the Omer frees them. Ve'im lav, if they took root after Pesach. Okay, so this is late grain. I mean, most grain is, remember, in a dry country, most grain is sprouting through the winter and is going to be harvested after Pesach, but it's already taken root. If it took root after Pesach, asurinat shavoha omer haba. If it took root after Pesach, you can't eat it until the next year's Omer. So that's the beginning of the Masechet of Hallah. Begins by defining what grains are subject to the mitzvah of Hallah. And then tomorrow we'll explore the Masechet in a bit more detail, and we'll pick it up from there.